Quebec City, Canada. August 17, 1943. The room is thick with brass. Generals and admirals from Britain, the United States, and Canada sit around a conference table that carries the weight of civilization on its edges. The First Quebec Conference, codenamed Quadrant, is the gathering where the Allied High Command will chart the course of the war. Plans for the Normandy invasion are being debated. The fate of millions hangs in the balance. The air is tense, fractious, the American and British chiefs of staff having come close to open argument over the pace of the Italian campaign. It is not a room that tolerates the frivolous. And then Lord Louis Mountbatten, commander of combined operations, rises from his chair and asks for a moment. Two junior officers wheel in a pair of carts. On one sits an ordinary block of ice. On the other sits a block of something that looks, at first glance, almost identical. Pale, solid, faintly translucent. Without a word of preamble, Mountbatten draws his service revolver and fires at the block of ice. It shatters. Shards skitter across the conference room floor. The generals blink. Then he turns the pistol and fires directly at the second block. The bullet ricochets off with a sharp metallic crack, embedding itself in the wooden paneling of the wall. One account records that a fragment grazed the leg of an admiral. Another describes General Henry Hap Arnold, chief of the United States Army Air Forces, picking up a hatchet and bringing it down on the second block with confidence, only for the blows to bounce back so hard they jarred his arm and shoulder badly enough to make him yelp aloud. The block was, for all practical purposes, undamaged. What Mountbatten had just demonstrated was picrete, a composite material made from water and wood pulp, frozen together into something that defied easy categorization. It was not quite ice and not quite wood. It was something altogether stranger, and it sat at the heart of one of the most extraordinary engineering proposals in the history of warfare. The British, facing a crisis in the North Atlantic that was threatening to strangle the entire Allied war effort, had conceived of a plan to build a ship from this material. Not a small ship. Not a modest experimental vessel. A ship 600 meters long, displacing 2.2 million tons, large enough to serve as a fully operational aircraft carrier in the mid-Atlantic. A ship that could be repaired with a bucket of water. A ship that its proponents genuinely believed could not be sunk. This is the story of Project Habakkuk. To understand why anyone would seriously entertain such a proposal, you have to understand what the North Atlantic looked like in 1942. By that point in the war, the German U-boat fleet had achieved something close to devastating supremacy over the convoy routes linking Britain and North America. Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded his submarines in wolf packs, coordinated groups that would shadow a convoy for days before striking in coordinated night attacks, overwhelming the escorts, and sending supply ships to the bottom in clusters. The tonnage losses were catastrophic. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, the Kriegsmarine sank over 3 million tons of Allied shipping. To put that in terms a person can grasp, at the peak of the crisis, more cargo was being sent to the bottom of the Atlantic each month than the Allied shipyards could replace. Britain depended on those convoys for survival. Food, fuel, raw materials, military equipment, all of it crossed the Atlantic in the holds of merchant ships, and those ships were dying in appalling numbers. The phrase used by those who studied the crisis was the Mid-Atlantic Gap, sometimes called the Black Pit. It referred to a vast stretch of ocean, roughly centered south of Iceland and east of Newfoundland, that lay beyond the range of land-based aircraft from either side. Patrol aircraft flying from Britain or from Canada could protect convoys on their respective ends of the route, but in the gap, sometimes stretching 500 miles or more, there was no air cover whatsoever. The U-boats had learned to hunt precisely in this space, where they could operate with near impunity. The obvious solutions were either unavailable or insufficient. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls, were being built, but the demand for steel to construct them competed with every other priority of a war economy under strain. There were simply not enough shipyard workers, not enough steel plate, not enough time. Long-range patrol aircraft existed, but not in sufficient numbers, and not with quite enough range to cover the gap entirely. The convoys sailed on, and the U-boats hunted them, and the losses mounted with a terrible, grinding regularity that kept the planners in Whitehall awake at night. Something had to change. The question was, what? It was in this atmosphere of desperate necessity that a man named Geoffrey Pike arrived at his solution. Geoffrey Pike is one of those figures in 20th century British life who defies simple description. Born in Kensington in 1893, he had the kind of biography that reads like a novel someone has assembled from spare parts. He had been a journalist who infiltrated Germany during the First World War under a false passport, was arrested, interned, and then escaped. An experience that fed a lifelong conviction that unconventional thinking could achieve what orthodox approaches could not. He had founded an experimental progressive school, lost a fortune on the commodity markets, and turned eventually to the problem of war with the same restless lateral intelligence he applied to everything else. By 1942, Pike was working under Mountbatten at Combined Operations Headquarters with the somewhat vague title of Director of Programs. His role was essentially to think the unthinkable, and he took to it with alarming enthusiasm. He had already designed the Weasel, a lightweight tracked vehicle for snow operations that would see service on the muddy roads of France. But his most audacious idea was the one he committed to paper in a lengthy memorandum that landed on Mountbatten's desk in late 1942. The core of it was simple, even if the implications were staggering. Steel was scarce, aluminium was scarce, but water was everywhere, and water could be turned into ice with a fraction of the energy required to produce an equivalent mass of steel. An iceberg, Pike reasoned, was essentially unsinkable. If you torpedoed it, you just made it smaller. What if you could make a ship that shared those properties? What if you could make a ship out of ice? The material problem was obvious, and Pike knew it. Natural ice is brittle and relatively weak. It fractures under impact. It melts. But in February 1943, Pike came across a report from American researchers, including Herman Mark and his assistant Walter Hohenstein, which pointed to something remarkable. Ice made from water mixed with wood fibers, even a very small percentage of wood fibers, behaved quite differently from ordinary ice. It was dramatically stronger. It was harder to melt. It had, in some ways, more in common with concrete than with the ice you find in a glass of water. Pike passed this report to Max Perutz, a Cambridge-based Austrian scientist who had fled Nazi Europe and would later win a Nobel Prize for his work on protein crystallography. Perutz was given access to a refrigerated storage space in the meat market at Smithfield in the City of London, and there, surrounded by hanging carcasses, he began experimenting with mixtures of wood pulp and water. The results were striking. He found that ice containing as little as 4% wood pulp was, weight for weight, roughly as strong as concrete and significantly tougher under compression than pure ice. It resisted fracturing. It resisted melting. It was, in short, a workable building material, available in theoretically limitless quantities from the most abundant substance on Earth. They called it Pikrit, in honor of its conceptual progenitor. The proposed vessel that would be built from this material was staggering in its dimensions. The final design, one of 3 variants studied by naval architects and known as Habakkuk II, called for a hull 600 meters in length, 90 meters wide, with walls 9 meters thick. The total displacement would be approximately 2.2 million tons. To put that in perspective, the largest aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy at the time displaced roughly 25,000 tons. The entire United States Navy in 1943 displaced less than Habakkuk II was designed to. Its deck would have covered roughly 6 acres, and it would have been capable of carrying as many as 200 Spitfire fighters or 100 Mosquito bombers. The walls would be traversed by a network of refrigeration ducts, because Pikrit, Perutz had established, would begin to creep and deform at the temperatures above about minus 16 degrees Celsius, requiring active cooling throughout the structure. 26 electric motors, mounted in external nacelles to avoid generating heat inside the hull, would drive the vessel at an anticipated 7 knots. Its armament would include 40 dual-barreled 4.5-inch guns. The name came from the biblical book of Habakkuk, chapter 1, verse 5. Be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. Before committing to anything so gigantic, someone had to determine whether pykrete would actually work at scale. In late 1943, a team of 8 engineers set up shop at Patricia Lake in Jasper National Park, Alberta, Canada, a remote mountainous location well away from prying eyes, with the cold temperatures required for reliable freezing. They were tasked with constructing a prototype, a floating platform built from pykrete blocks, large enough to demonstrate the material's properties under realistic conditions. The structure they built was approximately 18 meters long and 9 meters wide, weighing in at around 1,000 tons. It was fitted with an internal refrigeration system to test whether active cooling could maintain structural integrity. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. There is plenty more where this came from. The prototype performed well. It floated. It held its shape. It resisted the relatively mild Canadian summer temperatures far better than ordinary ice would have done. In one set of tests, a standard naval gun was fired at the pykrete hull from close range. The results were consistent with what Perutz had found in Smithfield. The material absorbed the impact without shattering, leaving only a limited indentation. Back in Quebec, Mountbatten's dramatic demonstration with the revolver had been no trick. The ricochet was real, the material was real, and the generals and admirals in the room that August day had seen it with their own eyes. Churchill himself, according to accounts, had been briefed earlier aboard the Queen Mary on his way to Quebec, and had come away enthused enough to describe pykrete as the potential basis for a revolutionary class of vessel. Mountbatten had supposedly floated a block in the Prime Minister's bathtub to demonstrate its buoyancy. The Americans, for their part, were interested but guarded. Their military establishment was, on balance, more skeptical of unconventional approaches than their British counterparts, and the sheer implausibility of building a floating aerodrome out of frozen wood pulp strained credulity even in a war full of improbable ideas. Nevertheless, the Quebec Conference produced a formal agreement to continue development under a joint British-American-Canadian board. The project had cleared its most critical political hurdle. What it never cleared were the engineering ones. The challenges of actually constructing a Habakkuk-class vessel, as opposed to a small prototype on a Canadian lake, turned out to be immense, and they multiplied the more closely the plans were examined. The refrigeration system alone was a problem of extraordinary complexity. Maintaining a 9-meter-thick hull of pykrete at a consistent minus 16 degrees Celsius or colder across a structure 600 meters long in the variable thermal environment of the open ocean required a network of ducting and cooling machinery on a scale that had never been attempted. The engineering estimates suggested that the refrigeration plant alone would require significant quantities of steel, the very material that the project was supposed to render unnecessary. One analysis suggested that Habakkuk II, for all its pykrete walls, would still require something like 26,000 tons of steel for its internal fittings, machinery, and structural elements. The cost estimates were equally sobering. Early projections put the price of a single vessel at around £8 million sterling, but as the design evolved, that figure climbed. By some assessments, it approached £10 million, a colossal sum for a single experimental ship with an uncertain operational life at a time when the Allied war economy was under enormous strain. There were also serious questions about how such a ship would be maneuvered into harbor, how it would be repaired if its refrigeration systems failed, and how it would cope with the kind of ocean swells that characterize the North Atlantic in winter. There were no directly equivalent German programs, Berlin had no equivalent of Pike's particular strain of lateral ingenuity, and the Kriegsmarine's approach to the U-boat war was operational rather than structural. The Americans had experimented with various escort carrier configurations, and the Casablanca-class escort carriers being produced in U.S. yards were a more orthodox response to the same problem. They displaced around 8,000 tons, carried about 28 aircraft, and could be produced in roughly 3 months from keel laying to commissioning. Fast, practical, built from well-understood materials by experienced shipyard workers following familiar processes. Compared to the years of development and the unprecedented manufacturing challenge that Habakkuk represented, they were unglamorous, but they worked, and they were available now. The killing blow came not from any single technical failure, but from a shift in the strategic landscape that the project had been designed to address. Through the first half of 1943, the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic was already beginning to turn. New, longer-range versions of the Liberator patrol bomber were finally closing the mid-Atlantic gap from above. More escort carriers were reaching the front. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park were providing intelligence on U-boat movements with increasing reliability. In May 1943 alone, the Allies sank 41 U-boats, a rate of attrition that Dönitz found unsustainable. He temporarily withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic. The gap that Project Habakkuk had been designed to fill was closing, and closing by means that did not require the construction of a 2-million-ton ship made of frozen wood pulp. By October 1943, the project was effectively dead. The Joint Board concluded that the strategic need had diminished and the engineering obstacles remained formidable. Work at Patricia Lake was wound down. The prototype was left on the lake as the seasons changed. It did not melt quickly. That, in the end, was perhaps the most vivid testament to what pykrete actually was. 3 Canadian summers passed before the structure at Patricia Lake finally broke up and sank to the bottom. 3 summers. In a country where summer temperatures routinely climb well above the freezing point, before a structure built from ice and wood pulp finally succumbed to the heat. The wreck is still there, at a depth of around 10 meters, marked by an underwater plaque installed by the Alberta Diving Council. It is, in all likelihood, the only aircraft carrier of any kind that has ever rested on the bottom of a freshwater lake in a national park. What Habakkuk achieved in practice was modest. No full-scale vessel was ever laid down. No aircraft ever launched from a pykrete flight deck over the Atlantic. The project spent a relatively small amount of money in the context of the broader war effort, proved several interesting properties of composite ice materials, and was then abandoned. As strictly military history goes, it sits in the column of interesting failures. Ideas that were generated by genuine need, explored with genuine seriousness, and then superseded by events before they could come to fruition. But that accounting sells it short. The story of Habakkuk is not, at its core, a story about engineering. It is a story about what happens when a civilization fighting for its survival is forced to think beyond the boundaries of the possible. The men who worked on pykrete in a meat market in Smithfield, who built a prototype on a freezing mountain lake in Alberta, who wheeled a block of frozen wood pulp into a room full of generals and fired a pistol at it, they were not fantasists. They were responding in the way that the British scientific establishment in the Second World War so often responded, with a kind of imaginative aggression to problems that appeared to have no conventional solution. Britain produced more genuinely strange and unexpected military technology in those years than any other nation. The Mulberry Harbors, the bouncing bomb, the Canal Defense Light, the assorted devices of the 79th Armored Division. Habakkuk belongs in that company. Max Perutz went on to win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1962. His work on pykrete rates barely a footnote in his official biography. Geoffrey Pike died in 1948, at the age of 54, in circumstances that were ruled a suicide. He left behind him the Weasel, the pykrete research, a progressive school that influenced educational theory for decades, and the memory of a man who saw the world differently from almost everyone around him, and occasionally turned that difference into something useful. The biblical book from which the project drew its name contains the verse, "Be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told." Pike chose that quotation deliberately, with characteristic immodesty. But there is a kind of honesty in it, too. Told in the abstract, the story of a British plan to build a 2-million-ton aircraft carrier out of ice and sawdust sounds like something a child might invent. Told in its full context, the burning merchant ships in the Atlantic, the exhausted convoy escorts, the scientists in Smithfield surrounded by hanging carcasses, testing frozen composites in the hope that water might save what steel could not. It sounds like something else. It sounds like a civilization that refused to accept the limits it had been given, and came, in the end, remarkably close to building the impossible. Return to that room in Quebec. The block of pykrete sits on its cart, undamaged. The generals are looking at it with new eyes. A bullet has bounced off it. Hap Arnold's arm is still smarting from the rebound of a hatchet. Mountbatten holsters his revolver. What they were looking at was not a gimmick. It was the product of months of research, conducted in meat lockers and mountain lakes by scientists who had run the numbers and concluded that the thing was, in principle, achievable. It was the product of a mind, Geoffrey Pike's mind, that had looked at the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean and the vastness of Allied need and concluded that the gap between them could be bridged by frozen water. The project never built its ship. The U-boats were defeated by other means, by long-range aircraft and escort carriers and the brilliance of the code breakers at Bletchley Park and the slow, grinding improvement of Allied anti-submarine tactics. History, as it so often does, found its own way around the problem without requiring the most audacious solution on offer. Habakkuk was shelved. Patricia Lake received its prototype. The plans went into the archives where they were declassified decades later to the considerable astonishment of anyone who read them. But the block of pykrete in that Quebec conference room was real. The bullet hole in the wall was real. The ricochets were real. And for a brief, extraordinary period in the middle of the Second World War, some of the finest scientific minds in Britain worked in complete seriousness on the proposition that the North Atlantic could be bridged by a floating island made of ice. They were not wrong to try. They were, in the end, not wrong about the material. The only thing that was wrong was the timing. By the time Habakkuk might have been ready to sail, the war it was designed to fight had already been won by other hands and other means. That is what makes it haunting. Not the failure, but the nearness of the success. Not the impossibility of the dream, but the strange, uncomfortable fact that it was not quite impossible after all. The ice held. It just held too late.